The trail of blood led straight to his well. Caleb Whittaker had seen enough wounded coyotes and buckshot deer in his 38 years on this unforgiving land to know when something wasn't right. But when he followed those crimson drops around the side of his barn, his hand froze on the rifle. Lying crumpled by the stone well was a young native man, barely conscious, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. His other hand reached weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just out of reach. This was 1847 in the New Mexico Territory, a time when harboring a native could get you strung up by your own neighbors. Caleb should have pulled the trigger. But what he saw in those dark, desperate eyes wasn't danger. It was thirst. Human, universal, desperate thirst. And that single act of mercy, one dip of water, would change both their lives forever. The young man drank like he hadn't seen water in days. One bucket, then two, then a third. His trembling hands finally steady enough to hold the rim on his own. Caleb Whittaker knelt in silence, watching each gulp with a pit growing in his gut. He'd seen what happened to folks who showed mercy to a savage in this part of the world. His neighbors would call him a traitor, a fool, a man too soft for frontier life. But it wasn't until the color started returning to the boy's face that Caleb noticed something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't a wound from a hunting mishap. It was a gunshot. Fresh, still bleeding, and judging by the powder burns around the edges. Whoever pulled the trigger was close, very close, which meant someone out there had shot this man and might still be tracking the blood trail straight to Caleb's well. The warrior, barely able to sit up, pointed to the horizon and made a cutting motion across his throat. No words needed. Danger was coming. Fast. Caleb's instincts screamed, drag him off the property, dump the body, burn the blood trail. But the kid couldn't walk, couldn't hide, couldn't even move. And Caleb wasn't about to leave a wounded man to die in the dirt. He grabbed an empty bucket and doused the trail as best he could. But there wasn't time to clean it all. Then he heard it hoof beats. 6, maybe more. Riders. Coming hard and fast. The young warrior pushed himself against the wall of the well, as if trying to vanish into stone. Blood soaked through his side again, and his breathing quickened. Caleb stood in front of him, blocking the view. Sweat trickled down his spine. Too late now. Over the ridge, the riders appeared. Like a dust storm rolling in from hell itself. 6 men on horseback, sunlight flashing off rifles. At the front, Marshal Silas Granger. Caleb's stomach sank. Granger was no lawman. He was a hunter, a killer, the kind of man who didn't ask questions. He gave orders and expected blood. Afternoon, Whittaker. The marshal called out with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're tracking a wounded Apache. Blood trail leads right to your well. Caleb forced a calm expression. Ain't seen anyone, Marshal. Been working the fence all day. But Granger's pale eyes scanned the property with surgical precision. They stopped on the blood-darkened dirt by the well. That's so. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, because that sure looks like blood to me. And unless you've been slaughtering hogs next to your drinking water, behind Caleb, the warrior didn't move a muscle. But Caleb could feel it, fear radiating off him like heat from a forge. Granger stepped closer. His hand rested on his pistol. You know the penalty for harboring fugitives, Whittaker, he said softly. Same as treason. Caleb's jaw tightened. And in that moment he knew. This wasn't just a wounded man. This was a powder keg. One wrong word, one twitch of the hand, and this ranch would become a graveyard. Caleb stood his ground, one hand resting casually on the well, his body a shield between the lawman and the wounded Apache hidden behind him. Marshal Silas Granger was now just 10 feet away, eyes cold, fingers tapping the butt of his pistol like a metronome of death. You're playing a dangerous game, Whittaker, Granger warned. Caleb didn't blink. Ain't playing nothing. Just patch and fence. The silence between them stretched, thick and brittle. That's when it happened. The Apache warrior behind Caleb spoke, not in English, but in a low, musical stream of his native tongue. Calm, steady, and unmistakably powerful. The words sliced through the tension like a knife. Marshal Granger froze mid-step. His face changed. Gone was the smug confidence. His eyes went wide, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Dear God, your I am. 5 of Granger's deputies dismounted so fast it was like a signal had gone off. They looked at the wounded warrior like they'd seen a ghost. And maybe they had. Caleb glanced behind him. The young man, barely clinging to life, raised his chin and said, in perfect English, Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you came here. Granger's jaw clenched. He looked like a man trying to swallow glass. This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takota, the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Ayanna. The name rang through his memory like thunder. The Apache negotiator who had stopped 3 years of bloodshed between settlers and tribes. The man who was supposed to be miles away, safe, building bridges between two worlds. And yet here he was, shot, bleeding, hiding beside Caleb's water well. But why would anyone shoot the man who brought peace? Caleb asked aloud. Ayanna answered without hesitation. There was an ambush. 3 days ago, I was meeting with Colonel Morrison to expand the treaty, but Morrison never made it out. Granger's face turned ashen. Colonel Morrison is dead, he said. Shot in the back during an Indian raid. That's the lie. Ayanna replied, his voice sharp despite the pain. Morrison was murdered by men wearing war paint, who spoke just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. He paused, letting that settle. Men who wanted the treaty broken, men who profit from war. The revelation hit Caleb like a hammer, a frame up, a political hit job. Someone wanted Ayanna dead, not because he was a threat to peace, but because he was a threat to their profits. Granger swallowed hard. You're talking treason. Corruption. You'd better have proof. Ayanna nodded. I do. With shaking fingers, he pulled a folded, blood-stained letter from the leather pouch at his belt. Morrison wrote this the night before he died. It names every man supplying weapons to renegade tribes, including someone in the marshal's office. Granger staggered back a step. He didn't deny it. He didn't even blink. His silence was all the confirmation anyone needed. The youngest deputy, a kid no older than 20, dismounted and stepped forward. Marshal, remember that shipment of rifles that went missing last spring? I saw those same rifles in the hands of settlers. He looked at Ayanna, then at Granger, and then said the words that cracked everything wide open. Maybe we've been hunting the wrong enemy. The air was heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Deputy Ely, the youngest of Granger's men, stood still in the dust, one hand half raised, the other hovering near his holster. I saw those rifles, Marshal, the same ones we said the Apache stole. Granger's jaw clenched. His voice came sharp. You accusing me? Boy. Ely didn't flinch. I'm saying things ain't added up for a while now. A murmur rippled through the other deputies. Men who had ridden under Granger's badge for years now looked at him like they'd never seen him before. Ayanna, still propped against the well, coughed, then held up the blood-stained letter again. This proves Morrison knew. He wrote down names, times, payment ledgers, even mentioned someone inside the marshal's office helping cover the smuggling routes. He stared straight at Granger. And he gave it to me, because he knew he wouldn't survive the meeting. The letter shook in Ayanna's trembling hand, but his voice never wavered. You were never sent to arrest me, Marshal. You were sent to silence me. Granger took a step forward, hand on his gun again. That letter's a forgery. Ayanna didn't move. Then read it. Granger didn't reach for the letter. He didn't even look at it, because he knew exactly what it said. The silence broke like glass. Deputy Marcus, a seasoned man with silver at his temples, dismounted and joined Ely. He glanced at the letter, then at Granger. I remember Morrison. Whatever else he was honest. He wouldn't write a letter like that without reason. Another deputy, Sarah Green, nodded. We've been chasing ghosts for months. Indians blamed for attacks that felt staged. Reports buried. Paperwork going missing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. We've been used. The deputies slowly surrounded Granger, but now they weren't flanking him. They were facing him. Caleb saw it. The shift. The tide turning. Granger must have felt it too, because his hand dropped fully to his gun. You're fools. He spat. You really think anyone believed the word of a dying Apache over a federal marshal? Ayanna stood straighter. I'm not asking them to believe me. He held up the letter again. I brought proof. Granger's hand trembled. Then, with a snarl, he drew his pistol, lightning fast. But not fast enough. Deputy Ely stepped forward, gun raised. Stand down, Marshal. His voice cracked like thunder. Granger froze, pistol half lifted, eyes wide. Deputy Green flanked him, weapon steady. Put it down, Silas. It's over. Caleb stood in stunned silence, watching everything unfold. The men who once rode under Granger's banner now circled him like a wounded predator. Ayanna's voice rang clear. You can draw your weapon, Silas, but it won't save you from the truth. The moment hung like a drawn bow. Then something extraordinary happened. Ayanna began to sing, not in English, not in words most of them could understand, but in the old Apache tongue, a low, echoing melody, carved from grief, from memory, from fire. It wasn't a war cry. It was something older, a song of warning and a call for justice. The hair on Caleb's arms stood up. The song rolled over the ranch like smoke, like wind through canyon walls. Even Granger's gun lowered, just slightly, because somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats answered the call. Many hoofbeats. Fast, unstoppable. Granger's head snapped toward the horizon, and his face turned to ash. Ayanna smiled through the pain. They heard me. The sound rolled in like thunder from a clear sky. Hoofbeats. Not half a dozen, not even a dozen. Dozens. Scores. The kind of sound that makes your chest tighten before your mind can understand why. Caleb Hartwell stood frozen near the well, eyes locked on the distant ridge. And over that rise came something out of legend, a formation of Apache riders, not charging, not screaming, just moving silently, in rhythm, with purpose. 50 strong, maybe more, in rows that cut across the setting sun like shadows with eyes. Their war paint caught the light. Their horses kicked up dust that shimmered like gold in the air. Granger backed up a step, then two, his pistol still in hand, but now shaking. Ayanna exhaled slowly. They've come to finish this. At the head of the riders was a man Caleb had never seen but somehow knew instantly, the chief. Tall, gray-haired, regal, a presence carved by time, war, and wisdom. He dismounted with slow purpose, walked alone toward the well, never breaking stride, never looking at Granger. Only at his son. Ayanna tried to rise. He winced but stood upright, barely. They embraced without a word, father and son, warrior and chief. The moment wasn't dramatic, it was sacred. Then the chief turned to face the gathering of white men and lawmen, his gaze falling last upon Marshal Granger. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the ranch like steel. You came here to kill my son? Granger's jaw flexed. He raised his pistol slightly. I came here to arrest a fugitive. The chief nodded slowly. A fugitive from your lies? He raised a hand, and a younger Apache stepped forward, carrying a satchel. From it, the chief pulled out a stack of letters and maps. Correspondence, documents, some written in Granger's own hand. The final nail, payments, dates, orders. Everything you used to feed this war. He paused. Morrison was thorough. Granger's eyes darted, like a cornered animal. The color drained from his face. But it was Ayanna who spoke next. You wanted me dead because I saw through the mask. He turned to the deputies, voice ragged but unwavering. Your marshal sold weapons to renegades, then blamed it on our people. Every drop of blood spilled on this land served someone's profit. Deputy Ely swallowed hard. Deputy Green looked down at her boots, but no one denied it now. Then the chief pulled out the last piece, a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges. Morrison's, he said simply, with a witness list. Granger's face collapsed. He took one last wild gamble, raised his pistol toward the chief. Then let's end it here. But Ayanna moved, fast. Despite his wound, he lunged forward, blocking the shot. The pistol cracked, and in the same second, Caleb Hartwell tackled Granger from behind with the force of a falling oak. They hit the dirt hard. The gun flew from Granger's hand. Dust and silence followed. Then the Apache encircled them, not with drawn weapons, but with watching eyes. The chief walked toward Caleb, then slowly laid his hands on Caleb's shoulders, spoke words in Apache, low and solemn. Ayanna translated, breathless. He says, you are no longer a stranger. You are now brother to our people. Caleb blinked. All he'd done was give a dying man water, and yet it had changed everything. The dust had settled. Granger was face, down in the dirt, wrists bound, eyes wide with the look of a man who had finally lost everything. Deputy Bradley stood over him, weapon still drawn, but trembling, not out of fear but the weight of truth. Tobias Hartwell, no Caleb, in this retelling, stared down at the broken man beneath him. He'd only meant to help a wounded stranger. Now he had stopped a conspiracy, disrupted a war, for-profit operation, and seen a marshal fall not by bullets, but by truth. Behind him, Ayanna sat weakly on a blanket laid by the well. His wound had been dressed by the tribe's healer. His breathing was still shallow but steady. He was alive. The council would hear him speak. Justice would have a voice. And it all began with a cup of water. The Apache warriors began to dismount, one by one, forming a wide circle around Caleb. There were no guns raised now, no tension. Only respect. They came forward silently, each one touching Caleb's arm, his shoulder, his hand, not as a greeting, but as a right, a gesture older than English. A welcome. A boy barely 12, his cheeks painted with blue swirls, offered Caleb a bundle of sage and a single hawk feather. An elder placed a palm over Caleb's heart, murmured something low in Apache, then nodded solemnly. Ayana, now seated upright beside his father, turned to Caleb and said, "He says, you are no longer a visitor to our land. You are family." Caleb swallowed hard. He'd lived alone on that ranch for 12 years, built every beam with his own 2 hands, fought coyotes and droughts and his own loneliness. But in this moment, surrounded by these warriors, these witnesses of history, he realized he'd never truly belonged anywhere until now. Then, the chief stepped forward, his eyes sharp, voices steady as the stone beneath their feet. "This," he said in clear English, "is the warlance of my grandfather. It has passed down 4 generations. It has never left our bloodline." He held it out, its shaft wrapped in rawhide, feathers tied tight near the spearhead, symbols etched deep in the wood. Until today. He placed it gently in Caleb's hands. The circle murmured a chant, low and rhythmic, carried by the wind. Caleb stood frozen, unsure what to say, until Ayana's voice rose. "You gave me water, Caleb, and in doing so, you gave our people back hope." That moment, that silence, was the kind that lives in the marrow long after the world moves on. As the sun began its descent over the ridge, casting the whole ranch in amber light, the Apache prepared to ride. Ayana would return to the council. Marshal Granger and Hawkins would be turned over to federal authorities, facing charges of treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The stolen weapons operation, dismantled within weeks, and the peace treaty, not only renewed, but expanded to include every tribe in the territory, including those long forgotten by the government. As for Caleb, he stayed on that same ranch, but he was no longer just a rancher. He was the first non-Apache man in the territory's history to be formally adopted by the tribe. His warlance hung proudly over the hearth, a symbol not of war but of courage. And when settlers passed through, lost or weary, needing shelter or food, Caleb never asked for names or papers. He just asked, "Are you thirsty?" Because sometimes, the smallest kindness, a hand, a sip of water, a moment of mercy, can stop a war before it ever begins. Caleb Hartwell once believed a man only needed land, water, and horses to survive the Wild West. But the day he gave water to a dying man, he didn't just save a life. He saved a peace treaty. He saved trust between 2 worlds taught to hate each other. And it all began, not with a gun, but with a bucket of water. This story reminds us compassion knows no borders, not race, not language, not politics. Courage isn't always about drawing a weapon. Sometimes, it's choosing what's right when everyone expects you to do wrong. And peace often begins with the smallest act. A glance. A decision. A simple choice. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. What would you do if a hunted man came to your door, just asking for water? Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that stir the soul. Tales of kindness, justice, and quiet bravery. And please, share this video, because somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for their one cup of hope.